Earlier this year, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services acknowledged the achievements of Reverend Eugene Cho with the Outstanding American by Choice Award for his contributions to combating hunger and poverty. The award, established back in 2006, applauds the advancements of naturalized American citizens. Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Reverend Eugene Cho, a recipient of this year's Outstanding American by Choice Award for his efforts to ease the plight of people. Reverend Cho, a warm welcome to you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Right, Reverend, let's begin then with your response to this recognition. What were your immediate thoughts upon hearing about the award?
To be honest, at first, I wasn't quite sure what the honor meant. I thought it was something that was a surprise in many ways. And certainly I was incredibly honored and privileged the more that I heard about the honor. And that news came from the White House here in the United States. But the moment that it really began to sink in very deeply was when I was at the White House to actually receive this particular honor. At that moment, I couldn't help but reflect back on not just my own life and journey, but to reflect upon my parents and my grandparents, the stories of my ancestors and family lineage. And I was overwhelmed by emotions, by pure gratitude for the grace that has been bestowed upon me. So again, I am so honored by this particular honor.
Right, so Reverend, you were honored for your contributions to easing the plight of people. Could you walk us through the events that paved your path, perhaps, to seeking an end to hunger?
Yeah, there's multiple reasons why this has been a life calling. It's not something that I'm trying to do in this season. It's not a clothing accessory that I wear because it's fashionable. It is something that is very, very important to me. And there's probably three reasons why it has become such an important calling, a conviction in my life. First, without sounding too preachy, as a minister, I'm a follower of Christ. As a Christian, I believe that my faith, as I study the scriptures, it shows that God has a deep conviction about those who are hungry and poor. And so that's the first reason why this is so important to me. The second reason is that nearly 30 years as a pastor, you begin to hear the stories of the people that you serve, not just in your particular church, but in your neighborhood and in your city as well. And as a result, the stories of those who struggle with hunger and poverty have become very personal. And then lastly, I would say that it's my family story as well. My father was born in what is now called North Korea. And it is hard to hear some of the stories that he and my mother endured as children of the Korean War. And so as a result, it has been very, very personal for me. And that's the reason why the fight to help end hunger around the world has become so personal.
Right, and staying with that, Reverend, you are now engaged with the Bread for the World, which you lead at the moment. Could you tell us a bit about this organization and its more notable feats, perhaps?
Sure. I have been serving as the president and CEO of this organization now for about 3 years. It was founded nearly 50 years ago, and a group of religious leaders got together and they said that there were so much issues of hunger and poverty, and they were doing all that they could to help alleviate hunger, but they realized they needed to get to the root causes of what creates hunger around the world. And so Bread for the World is a Christian advocacy organization urging our lawmakers here in the United States, and then also partnering with other organizations around the world to urge their lawmakers to do all that they can to help end hunger, both in the United States and also around the world. Just last year in October, we helped work on a legislation called the Global Malnutrition Prevention and Treatment Act. One bill, one legislation. We took about 3 years working on it, but this one bill that was signed by the president will have the opportunity, the possibilities of impacting tens of millions of women and children around the world. This is just one example of many of the significant victories that Bread for the World and our members all around the country have been able to achieve.
Right, good to know. Reverend Cho, before we talk further about your organization, could you tell us a bit about your thoughts with regard to why hunger remains a persistent global challenge?
Well, thank you for asking that question. I think one of the things that we have to do is keep raising awareness. There are so many things going on around the world, whether you live in Korea, in the United States, in Europe. We know that there's so much going on around the world. And sometimes hunger is one of those hidden or unspoken injustices and issues of pain that exist around the world. And we have to keep shining the light around the world. So the reality of hunger is that it is a worldwide problem. Even as I speak to you right now, more than 780 million people around the world experience variety issues of hunger even as we speak. In 51 countries, more than 40 million people are experiencing acute levels of hunger and malnutrition. And sadly and tragically, it also impacts, most of all, women and children around the world. So why does it continue to persist? The reasons are multifaceted. Certainly issues of climate change, issues of injustice and corruption, certainly the effects of pandemic and the global pandemic, and now conflict in various places around the world, including Ukraine, have contributed to rising amounts of hunger around the world.
And that being said, Reverend, what can ordinary people like myself do to ease global hunger, do you think?
Thank you again for that question, because the last thing that I want to do is overwhelm people with statistics. The average person might be listening to this interview and feel like they're overwhelmed. The reality is a single person cannot change the entire world or fix everything, but all of us can do our part. And so it begins with awareness. Let's continue to learn. As you're watching this interview, don't let this be the end of your education. Let's continue to learn about hunger issues in our cities, in our nation, and also around the world. We would also encourage people to partner with their trusted direct relief organizations. Be generous with your resources. But in addition to giving of our own generosity, we want to encourage people to raise their voices and urge their lawmakers in their respective country, asking their country to do their part to help end hunger around the world. One great example, I think, is Korea. As you know, Korea 60 years ago was a nation ravaged by war and conflict. 60% of that country was living in extreme poverty. And as a result of just tremendous development in the country, but also our nation, Korea, received support from others, we are now a significant contributing nation to the fight against hunger around the world.
Reverend Cho, you have a book titled Overrated. Are we more in love with the idea of changing the world rather than actually changing the world? What is your response?
Well, the answer is mixed. I am encouraged by the fact that people want to make a difference. So let's stop there for a second and affirm that good quality among our humanity. I'm grateful that we live in a world, in a society where people do want to make a difference. But in a culture that's driven oftentimes by projection, how we look and how we appear to others, in a culture driven by social media, there's a temptation to look a certain way and not do the hard, persistent marathon work of mercy, of justice, and compassion. And so I want to encourage everyone to not just live for themselves, but ask the question, how can we bless our neighbors? How can we bless those who are less fortunate than we are? How can we partner with others to create a more just, compassionate, and beautiful world?
Reverend Cho, this is an impromptu question. You also have another book. It's titled Thou Shalt Not Be a Jerk. I think your titles are very catchy. There's some great food for thought right there. Could you tell us a bit about that particular book as well?
Yes, so the subtitle is Thou Shalt Not Be a Jerk, A Christian's Guide to Engaging Politics. I think we're living in a world right now, whether you approach life from a faith or a non-faith lens, where politics has become the main means by which people see themselves, see others, and see the world. There's a danger when political affiliation becomes our main tribal identity. And so this book is an imperfect attempt by me as a pastor, trying to encourage Christians, but really anyone that wants to have a listening ear, how to better navigate the world of politics. We know that politics matter because it shapes policies, and policies ultimately impact people. And more often than not in the political process, it's usually the strong, the mighty, or the wealthy who get their voices heard. And I want to encourage people to make sure that we exercise our voice to also advocate not just for ourselves, but to advocate for others who in an unjust world may not have their voices heard.
Reverend Cho, I understand you also have roots up north, in North Korea that is. Has this particular reality had an impact, a significant impact that is, on your dedication to easing the plight of people in general?
Very much so. As I shared earlier, my father was born in a small little village outside of a larger city called Pyongyang, the capital city now of North Korea. It's really interesting because when people ask my father, who's now 87 years old, where he was born, his response is Korea. And when they ask North or South, it takes him a few moments to understand the question because, as many of your listeners know, back during my father's generation, there was only one country that was eventually severed by war and separated. The stories that he shares are incredulous. There are moments he shares that he had to pull out grass from the ground in order to consume it to satisfy hunger pangs. That as a young boy, one of his jobs was to go around the garbage cans outside restaurants and to collect eggshells. And he would collect hundreds of used eggshells and give it to my grandmother, who would grind it for hours, if not days, into fine powder. And she would then pour it into boiling water so that her 7 children could have access to calcium through the eggshells. And so these stories have been very impactful to my calling and conviction. And here's the tragedy of it all. The tragedy is that these stories that I share are not just stories of my father from 70 plus years ago. These are also stories that are happening around the world, even as we speak. And that's the reason why people need to care, pay attention, and do their part.
Reverend Cho, earlier on you spoke about how 780 million people around the world are exposed to some form of hunger. Does this include statistics there in the US as well? Because interestingly, we are aware that there is hunger problems across the world in more of the more impoverished worlds, that is. But what about the states that in the US?
Absolutely. It does include the United States. Some of our latest research shows that approximately 40 million Americans here in the United States, supposedly the wealthiest nation in the world, but 40 million Americans experience what we call food insecurity. They're not quite sure where their next meal will come from, or if they do have enough to eat, it's not necessarily nutritious food. And there's a difference between food and nutritious food. And we want to make sure that every single human being has access to nutritious food. And one more thing that I'll share is that it is unconscionable to think that there are 9 million children here in the United States who experience food insecurity.
And keeping that statistic in mind, Reverend Cho, what more perhaps could be done to ease the plight of children there in the US then? Are policies being hammered out to address that reality?
Well, I mean, I think that's the question that we keep asking at Bread for the World, because our work centers around creating policies and legislations that are more dignified, that are more humane, that are more just. This is constantly the work that we are working on. Whether it's something called the child tax credit here in the United States, whether it's right now a discussion around the Farm Bill, which impacts so many people, both here in the United States and also around the world. It is one of the things that continues to drive us as we center certainly everybody, but also making sure that every single child, both here in this nation, but also around the world, have an opportunity not just to survive, but have the possibility to thrive.
And against that backdrop, Reverend Cho, what have been the broader implications of the pandemic that is, COVID-19, and the ongoing warfare in Ukraine on the fight against global hunger?
Well, I wish I had good news, but as you can probably surmise, even by asking that question, there are real challenges. Even before the global pandemic, research shows that the world actually hit a ceiling in the fight against extreme hunger and poverty around the world. It was digressing. It was digressing particularly because of other areas of conflict and because of the rising challenges of climate change around the world. But certainly with the global pandemic and now the war in Ukraine, most folks may not know that Ukraine and Russia, they're considered the breadbasket of the world. They produce approximately 30% of the global wheat supplies. And so because of that, and then rising costs because of inflation, the cost of fuel and fertilizer, what that has all created is sadly a storm that has created one of the worst global hunger crises in the last 50 years. This is the reason why there has to be a sense of urgency for individuals, for organizations, and certainly for nations as well.
Aside from your engagement, well, your lead that is, with regard to Bread for the World, Reverend Cho, you also founded back in the year 2009 One Day's Wages to fight poverty across the world. Could you tell us a bit about that body, One Day's Wages, that is?
Yeah, so One Day's Wages is a 14-year-old organization. And my wife and I and our 3 children, we started this together. And long story short, we were convicted about 13, 14 years ago to start this organization because we saw with our own eyes some of the injustices and pain of hunger and poverty all around the world. And because we have been so blessed, because we live a life of privilege, because of all the personal reasons that I had shared with you about even my parents' story, we wanted to do something beyond just learning and knowing more about issues of hunger and poverty. And what ended up happening is that as people of faith, we prayed and we felt like God led us on a journey. And for 3 years, we saved, we simplified, and we sold things that we didn't need. And as a result, we started this organization called One Day's Wages. Through 3 years, we saved enough resources to donate 1 year's wages of our own salary. And then we tried to invite and inspire people around the world to consider giving just 1 day of their wages. And we're so pleased to share that 14 years in, this organization, we still sit on the board. We have a tremendous team, but we've been able to raise and invest $10 million in small partnerships all around the world, impacting many, many people.
That's very impressive, Reverend Cho. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic front, Reverend Cho, what role can Korean Americans like yourself play to perhaps better promote ties between South Korea and the U.S.?
I was born in Korea and immigrated to the United States when I was 6 years old. And even though I am a naturalized U.S. citizen, as you shared earlier in the program, my Korean American bicultural identity is very, very important. I'm also part of communities here in the United States. For example, I'm a member of an organization called Council of Korean Americans. And it's a gathering of hundreds and hundreds of Korean Americans who care about what it means, not just to be a good citizen here in the United States, but also wanting to be active in helping promote good relationships between Korea and the United States as well. And I think that begins again by education and by knowledge, and also growing in a sense of pride in this privilege that we have to be Korean Americans. Now, those are some tangible, small ways that I think we can contribute to this important relationship between Korea and the United States.
Reverend Cho, we'll end with a few words perhaps about your future endeavors with regard to Bread for the World then.
Well, I would love to first encourage people, if they have a moment, to just learn more about Bread for the World by visiting us online at bread.org. But this work about helping end hunger at Bread for the World and elsewhere, it's not a sprint. It's not a simple social media post. It's a marathon. We recently hosted a gathering in Washington, D.C. with hundreds of our members from around the country, and our theme was perseverance. And so along those lines, we want to continue to persist in our strategy by urging our lawmakers to do all that they can, but to also focus on all of the key contributing factors, the root causes, whether it's issues of gender inequity, whether it's climate and hunger, whether it's economic injustice, whether it's issues of corruption, and the list goes on. And so we want to encourage people who might be listening to this program or watching this program, again, to follow us and to learn more about how they might be able to partner with Bread for the World at bread.org.
I see. All right, Reverend Cho, thank you so much for making the time to join us live on this program. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and congratulations on your award.
Thank you again so much. 감사합니다.
Right, 감사합니다. And that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. Do join us again tomorrow, that is Wednesday.